tonight. Very pleased to be here. So certainly one of my favorite novels that I've read for quite a while now. Congratulations. And will be the cover review of this weekend's New York Times Book Review, which is very exciting. Well done. So we're going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes, just have a chat, and then it will be open to all of you for questions, comments, mainly questions though, please. So now let's. I'm curious. I don't subscribe to that idea that writing is autobiographical, but I'm wondering sort of if you could talk us through a little bit about where this book came from. And I was curious. I know you spent a lot of time in the last few years doing journalism partially in this region, and I was curious if it was sort of sparked by that experience, or.
Yeah, it was definitely sparked, I would say, both by my experiences as a journalist. First, to thank you all very much for coming out, and to the Strand for having me. I'm just so eager to answer your questions. I couldn't remember to say that. So yeah, definitely some of the novel's origins have their roots very deeply in the journalism that I've done. But I think even preceding that, the novel really started as soon as I began writing my first book, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears. And so that novel, I think, sparked a kind of internal conversation about what happens to people who have sort of lost their homes, to people who are responding to large-scale traumatic events and who are sort of forced to reconstruct their lives. And that novel kind of began this process for me of trying to figure out like how my own personal experiences are definitely intertwined with that. And so this novel took a lot of those considerations into the fact that I've really written from the point of view of somebody who has spent a long time in the United States and is trying to recover their home, somebody who's been born in America and has family members who have come from chaotic, traumatic events in Africa. And finally, with this novel, I thought, well, here's a chance to actually kind of go back to the very beginning. Here's a chance to sort of write about an experience that actually precedes a lot of the sort of great traumatic events that happened in the post-colonial era in Africa. And a lot of that I was able to do some of that because of my work as a journalist, because I traveled through Sudan and Eastern Congo and Northern Uganda, and I'd witnessed the sort of after effects of a lot of violence. I was oftentimes in post-conflict situations, and so I became kind of curious about what happens to people who are sort of left in that malaise that happens along those borders. And two, also some of the men that I'd met who were these potential revolutionary figures who had this capacity to possibly do something good, but oftentimes ended up being I don't want to say evil, but rather difficult men who had sort of committed rather violent acts in the name of liberating a country. And so those men kind of embedded themselves in my imagination over the course of many years. And I realized that I hadn't quite figured out a way to discuss them in their full complexity. You know, writing about them as a journalist gave me some windows to do so, but there's a lot of things that I hadn't been able to say quite yet, and the novel became a chance for me to do that.
In a way, you were kind of trying to maybe go back to the kind of like the fathers of the generation now.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this would be the last out of the 3 books that I wrote, but in many ways it's actually, chronologically would kind of be the first, because it is the book that begins before, my narrator's coming into him. He's been in America for 15 years already by the time the first novel begins. My second novel narrator was born in the United States, and this was a chance to actually see, well, where were we before all of that happened? And there was this great moment of optimism that really captivated me as well. I wanted to write initially with the idea that here's a chance to tell a story born not out of the sort of wake of violence, but out of the moments that preceded it, and then see what happens when you begin to let the characters descend from there.
Yeah, I thought a bit about that great Wordsworth line about the French Revolution, which was that bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, to be young was very heaven. And you sort of felt like there's, especially the first half of the novel, is great optimism there. And then, of course, it sours pretty quickly.
Yeah, and even within that idea, I mean, I didn't know actually that would happen at the very beginning. I really felt like these characters were going to be so full of joy. And in my mind, they actually are at the beginning of the novel. They are rather optimistic, even though that optimism is tinged with a kind of bittersweet sense of reality. They know that they are still very much on the margins of the society, but they do have this sense that if they can get to this capital, Kampala, that somehow they will be able to take a certain agency, certain control over their lives, and they'll be able to join the lingering traces of the sort of post-independence fervency that was happening. And then, of course, at the same time that when you begin to set up characters like that, you already have a certain tension built into the narrative, because you know that there is going to be a decline that follows.
I mean, so when you started writing, they could have gone on to be sort of, as it would, good revolutionaries, or I mean, you weren't certain that they would turn out
No, I wasn't certain. I think unfortunately history sort of gave me very limited options in some ways to make them good revolutionaries. We didn't have that many of those good revolutionaries. You know, oftentimes a lot of these men started off as good revolutionaries, I think, but then there are failures of state that I think turned them into autocratic dictators in many cases. And then at the same time, you know, there's a parallel that was happening in my mind between that moment of optimism that was taking place in Africa and the same things that were happening here in the States. Where
in the 1970s?
Yeah, early 1970s, like you said, sort of post-1960s period. So when you have independence in Africa in 1962, 1963, and you have the civil rights movement, you know, kind of reaching its peaks in between 1963 and 1965. And so I thought there are a lot of important echoes that are happening here. You have a strong sense of independence and revolutionary movements sort of really winning their struggle to some degree, and then at the same time as those battles were being fought and potentially won, really quickly you began to realize that there was actually they weren't going to be able to go as far as they had hoped. You know, that there was going to be a limit, and slowly they were going to be undermined.
Yeah, and it's wonderful how you capture that kind of that disillusionment, but without, I mean, to be fair, it's funny because it's a political novel, but you don't actually talk about politics that much. I mean, it's sort of more like politics is seen through personality, through individuals kind of realizing their limits and coming up against these forces. But there isn't a lot of talk of isms and
no. No, but I do think of it as, because I think we have a sort of a limited idea of what we mean by the political novel in the States, and I do find that a bit frustrating. I think, you know, I was writing this novel while mainly also living in France, where there's no doubt that when you write a story, you can engage with political ideas, and political ideas sort of being larger than any particular ism, rather, and being larger than a sort of left or right ideas. But the fact that we are all wed to certain political realities in our lives, and those political realities in our lives become quite existential. They help determine and shape the way we live in our societies. And whether you know it or not, you're inevitably writing a political novel as soon as you start making aesthetic decisions as a writer. Once you begin to choose to tell X story versus Y story, that act carries within it a political intent, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. And so this novel for me is political in that sort of larger sense, in the fact that, like, you can't remove characters from the context that creates them. And at the same time, when you distill those political ideas onto a very individual, personal plane, it's the only chance you get to really actually experience what politics mean. You know, they don't mean the sort of mass movements or rallies or sort of who you vote for. They mean what happens to a person's ability to love the person that they're with, what happens to a person's ability to actually potentially succeed in their lives, and there's frustrations that they experience as a result of not being able to do so, and definitely the violence that sometimes comes with failed political dreams.
And speaking of context, I was curious, so the novel is sort of, it's both in a place, certainly in a time, it's in a place, but also oftentimes, at least the experience I had reading it was that it was sort of out of a place. I mean, it could have been any number of countries. I don't know if that was something that were you trying to sort of tell a story about what happened in many different places, or were you trying to be a bit more specific than? Yeah,
I added a certain anxiety over that decision, and initially the novel actually had no, other than the town in the Midwest, Laurel, there were no specific names.
Which could be anywhere.
Exactly, and actually, as far as I could tell,
like Springfield.
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking of The Simpsons, of course, when writing that. But you know, and part of the idea was definitely out of a sort of quiet reference to V.S. Naipaul's Bend in the River, where there's a deliberate attempt to resist naming the particular city, even though you can understand quite quickly that this is happening in what was then Zaire and now Congo, just by the context of the novel. And so I did think that even if I didn't name this as Kampala or Uganda, if you knew anything about the Writers' Conference Union in 1962, you'd be able to figure out that it was Kampala. And I had a kind of anxiety about wedding the novel too closely to a certain political reality that people would then wait to see if the novel was able to mirror that, because I wasn't trying to write about the sort of specific events of Uganda in the late 1960s, early 1970s, even though those events did become the sort of origins of the novel, right? They were important to my imagination, but I really needed to be able to break and depart from that. And unfortunately, I had a very wise editor who was hiding quietly in the back,
taking no credit,
who did quietly suggest that perhaps I was actually decontextualizing the narrative too much, that I wasn't actually allowing the story to gain at least enough specificity for the readers to feel like they weren't inhabiting a purely fable mythic land, in which I didn't want as well. There's a sort of emptiness that happens in doing so. So quickly, the novel is Kampala, definitely, but it is very much the Kampala of my characters.
Right, it's referred to as sort of the capital. which could be kind of that kind of like nightfall, sort of the sense of it anywhere.
Yeah, and and it's the same process of also renaming that happens to the city and to the country that happens to the characters as well. So the characters are sort of stripped of their names, they adopt new names, they invent new names for themselves, and they extend that same privilege and right over to their landscape as well. The characters decide that, well, you can call it Kampala, but at the same time, for me, it's something else. It's something larger than just one specific idea. It's an entire moment in history that I want to be a part of and feel like I can be a part of. And the only way for me to be able to claim that level of ownership is to give it a new name, is to reimagine it as something else, and which is also what they do with their own lives. They are trying to escape their own particular individual histories, and so they replicate that act onto the cities.
Yeah, and actually, in a way, I thought it was interesting that at least the experience of the two Isaacs, that in college they're doing what actually a lot of college students who aren't in a revolutionary experience do, which is to kind of reinvent themselves and to find a new name. They just happen to reinvent themselves amidst with guns and bombs. Yeah,
and the same thing happens with a lot of young revolutionaries that I've met in Africa. So you go into a sort of a conflict zone and you see these young men who have rebranded themselves as, and they do so under very violent terms, as Rambo, as Schwarzenegger, as RoboCop. And that RoboCop perhaps not, but they do come up with rather elaborate names, and definitely sort of references to very strong political leaders, including you can still hear people calling themselves Che or Selassie. And so that process of renaming is still really central to what happens in these conflict areas, and I, for some reason, couldn't help but want to transfer that to my characters.
And I guess for that earlier generation, there's a pastor, I'm going to get this wrong, but when he's sort of saying the different names that you hear around campus, like Kenyatta and
Césaire
and others, and so there's that kind of naming of oneself as an identification with that movement.
Yeah, and very much a naming also too of the men who were at that time still rather heroic figures, right? So their initial names that they adopt are the names of these wonderful political figures who are on the path in many cases to becoming autocrats and to becoming tyrants. And there's also a quite deliberate echo to my first novel, where the characters go through this process of naming all the different dictators and coups that have happened throughout Africa's history, and that process of naming them becomes a way of kind of acknowledging the political reality, and as a way of saying, well, these stories aren't forgotten. We have to sort of keep them alive by we bear witness by knowing the names of who these men are, and now these characters sort of precede that process, and they actually are renaming themselves because these men are still heroic figures.
And you play kind of interesting game isn't the right word, but you play with the idea of naming, and I don't want to give it away. I don't know if people have finished the novel yet, but that the sort of, there's a sense that sort of the names even that we are told aren't necessarily, I mean, at the end you kind of left a little disoriented about it, like exactly what does the name mean, who if someone, who they say they are.
Yeah, which was my attempt also, I wanted to try to see if I could write something that was kind of a bit of a mystery, and this was as much a mystery as I could come up with, was to be like, I'm just going to not give them a real name and make the readers tied somewhat loosely to their chair in that process.
It worked.
Good, well, I hope so. But it also becomes really difficult to talk about the story then without, and I always feel bad for the people who have been forced to review it, to see what sort of weird contortions they have to go through, where they're like, well, so-and-so's narrating it now and not narrating it. And then even for myself, still trying to figure out how to talk about who's telling the story without confusing myself or the audience.
And just, it's not just a novel purely about revolutionary politics. I want to make that clear to people who haven't read it yet. There's a great kind of love story that takes place in the Midwest with a woman named Helen and this Isaac. So I'm curious about, first of all, you very effectively kind of jump back and forth, which is something that few writers are able to pull off between the sort of Isaac's backstory and their love story. And I'm curious sort of why you picked the Midwest and sort of what you see her role. I mean, because she has in some ways a similar, she's also sort of lost a bit like Isaac.
Yeah, she is. And I think
I mean, why aren't they in New York or something, for instance?
Part of it is very just personal. Like I came from Ethiopia, and we were raised in the Midwest, and I was always deeply sort of attached to that landscape. I was kind of fascinated by the oddity of what happens to somebody who leaves Ethiopia and arrives in Peoria, Illinois, and how strange that must have been for my father. Like, I mean, for me, I was only a child, so whatever. I was happy to be, watching baseball by the time I was 3 or 4. But I don't think I'm still trying to figure out what that must have been like for my parents.
Have you ever asked him or their parents about that?
I have. My father has a story of one of the first things he does when he gets off the plane. My wife, my mom, and my sister and I were still in Ethiopia. Is he has like $3 in bills, and the first thing he does is he goes and buys an ice cream cone. Which I don't know if that's true or not, but I really like that story, and I think that's a sort of strangely American gesture to make for someone who wants to become American, because there wasn't much ice cream in Ethiopia in 1978. So I could really imagine getting off a plane and being like, you know what, I'm going to just do this thing about like getting ice cream. And since then I haven't gotten any other details. But part of it was definitely out of a desire to want to kind of return to that landscape. And two, Helen was also a chance for me to kind of tell a story from the other point of view. So we often know the story of or I've tried to tell the story of what happens to the migrant who comes to the United States. But I thought it was also interesting to kind of reverse that gaze and see what happens to look at the world from the opposite, from the person who's actually at home, and as you said, is also a little bit lost. We tend to think of the immigrant story as being the story of someone who's lost, but in fact, I think people are oftentimes very deeply lost in their own homes. You can be born and raised in the same small town and feel completely isolated and dislocated from it without ever having to leave or be forced to flee your home. You can feel quite alienated from your community just by being there. And so Helen became a chance to do both of those gestures at the same time, to witness what happens when somebody comes into your community, and at the same time to feel like, all right, well, here's a chance to sort of show that this sort of idea of a migrant narrative is actually a construct, and that in fact we bear these things across all racial ethnic lines.
And also I think maybe it was an interesting reflection I found it to be of between the America that the dream of the immigrant that kind of that's coming to this place that obviously for Isaac offers hope and a different kind of life and safety really from what's happened to his friends. But also, is a kind of America that feels sort of lost and kind of on the decline. And you describe Laurel as a place with, kind of derelict homes and all that. And this is in the 70s. Forget even sort of today what some of these communities might look like. So it's sort of you're sort of challenging that idea of the promise of America as well.
Yeah, there is. And it's to challenge the ideas, not because I don't think there's a sort of promise in America, but you always kind of want to complicate the sort of simplicity of that narrative. And there's a way in which, Laurel's kind of state is quite emblematic also of Kampala. Like, these two places are very much in conversation with one another throughout the novel. They both stories, one set in Africa, takes place around a college campus. Isaac's and Helen's love story kind of also takes place around the same sort of small town campus, although in a different context. And there is a sort of a way in which the sort of politics of Laurel are still frustrated by and large when it comes to racial relations, and the same way that Isaac and his friend in Kampala are still the bearers of a failed political revolution.
And I wonder if you talk a little bit about like the dreams of cities. There's this amazing, maybe 2-page passage when Isaac's talking about his father and used to tell him this story about I don't know if you want to maybe tell people, but I thought it was a very moving kind of meditation on here they're trying to construct. His father says that his father used to tell him a story about a city that disappeared when everyone went to sleep at night. And the idea is that in order for the city to survive, and the way the city has survived is that everyone has a responsibility to bear some part of the city in their dreams. So everyone in this village, everyone in this town, they're all obliged to sleep every night dreaming of one particular part of the city, and as long as they continue to do so, the city is able to live. But eventually people grow tired of having to be wed to the same dreams, and so one person says, well, I'm tired of dreaming this dream. Another person says the same, and gradually people begin to shed their responsibilities until eventually one day a young man says, well, it's okay, I'll do all the dreaming for you. And so people begin to assign him that role, and once they assign him that role, they've relinquished their authority over the city, and they've passed it on to somebody else. Their responsibility has been transferred over to somebody who then begins to transform the city into what he wants it to be. He begins to then erase certain streets, he begins to erase people, and until eventually one day the people realize they actually don't know what city they live in anymore. All of it's been sort of warped and distorted by this person and the problem is they are the ones who are responsible for that. They say that this person is our dictator who has done this to the place, but in fact they have given that agency over to him, and so that transfer of power isn't usurped so much as it's passed over. Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful metaphor for the sort of the democratic small d kind of dream.
Yeah, it is, and it's very much tied to that idea that we all bear responsibility for the way our countries exist. You know, we can't sort of pretend that we aren't all culpable. So if our cities, our countries fail in certain ways, we are all responsible for that. We can't just pretend that it's because that person is in power that happens. Whether or not we choose to recognize that we bear some of that.
Perhaps you were commenting on the state of America today. No comment.
You're probably always commenting on the state of America. You know, and I was writing this novel so very much while far away. Most of the novel was written while living in Paris, and so it was quite strange to know that I was always looking back to America from a rather distant gaze, and deeply involved with it at the same time. But I think it probably does change the way you write about it when you're not here. And I hadn't been in the States. I hadn't lived in the States for 5 years. In 3 of those years, I was really not that often in the country, but still very much tied to what was happening here and trying to figure out and trying to find ways of writing about America from that distance.
But how do you think it changes? I mean, did you feel alienated from America, or you felt like you had a better perspective on it, or?
I think it probably gave me a slightly better perspective. I think it was really interesting to try to turn to these issues, especially writing about a small town in the Midwest and trying to think about all the fraught ways in which race plays a role in people's lives, and all the ways in which people feel trapped inside of their own lives in these small places, and knowing that I'd also felt the same way growing up in Peoria and in the suburbs of Chicago. It seemed easier to take on some of those challenges because of that sort of emotional distance that had happened by being away. You
had felt what way? That sort of distant from the culture in Peoria, or
distance?
No, sorry. You had felt which way? Sorry, growing up.
Oh, just kind of sort of locked in. You know, locked in by not so much by geography, but by the idea that you were. You know, definitely sort of the color of my skin growing up, sort of black, and in a very sort of privileged community or high school that set very strict terms in terms of what I thought I could be or couldn't be. And so it was, I think, took time for me to be able to return to that and try to figure out how to write about it.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit, you had a piece in Granta during Barack Obama's first election with the headline, "The Past Remains With Us." I don't know if that was your headline or...
No, that wasn't.
Granted. Okay, well, but I was sort of struck by that because it seemed like that was one of the themes of this book, that you're sort of the haunting of the past, that even Isaac comes to America, he tries to escape, and yet it's still... past is always with him. And then America, I mean, you might want to talk a little bit about sort of racism. There's this very moving passage when Helen and Isaac go to a diner, and it's the kind of racism I think that, you know, in the North people have sort of prided themselves on not having the classified racism of Jim Crow, but in fact it was very prevalent, is still prevalent in some areas today.
Yeah, and that's the kind of racism that, or I think racism is sometimes a little bit too easy of a term, right? It sort of serves as the sort of total thing that that doesn't allow for much nuance, when in fact it's about the way in which, you know, people believe that they have moved forward or that progress has been made. When in fact, when you begin to sort of show those relationships on a more intimate scale, you can begin to see how we don't actually have a language. So part of the gesture of racism in that moment, it's not really with words, right? No one actually says anything that's really violent, but yet you can see the way these characters are treated, and the way the gestures are the ones that are the most emblematic and important. And the novel also has very strong echoes between the way this sort of relationship between Isaac and this white woman Helen are played out, and the way the relationship between Isaac and Joseph in Africa is also played out. These sort of like complexities of people having the right to love whoever they want to love, whether it's based on the color of their skin or gender or the sort of love of two friends. All three forms of love are sort of placed in crisis. And I wanted to see if I could find ways of linking, you know, the sort of problems that come with segregation and racism, also with the problems that comes with all forms of discrimination across, you know, gender and color lines. Right. I mean, because there is not explicitly, but a kind of a very intense relationship between two Isaacs, but also between Isaac and Joseph as well. Yeah, very much. Which of course is something that I think isn't normally confronted within that kind of context. I was struck reading this novel because we're watching what's happening in the Ukraine, what's happened in Egypt, and it seems like there was a lot of parallels sort of with what you're writing about and with what we've seen on the streets there, which is that sort of these young revolutionaries, and they're out in the street and they have this idea, maybe,
of what could be, or just an idea that they want something different. And then, of course, the reality, as we've seen in Egypt, is much, much darker and more complicated and bloodier. And I don't know if you've felt any kind of interesting parallels as you've been watching that as well.
Yeah, very much so. And one of the things that I thought of constantly while writing this was sort of all the young men that I spent time with in different places. Like there's this sort of group of young men in Darfur, outside of the sort of village that had been burned out, that I spent a couple days with, and we had really nothing to do. The war was happening kind of all around us, but nothing actually specifically where we were. And every night these boys would kind of like sit guard over us because we were the, sort of the two journalists, and they just sort of felt strangely responsible for us. And they were all 14, 15, 16 years old, and every one of them, to their dying breath would claim that they were revolutionary. And then I would ask them, well, what were they revolutionaries for? And they would, repeat a certain level of familiar political rhetoric, that they were there to defend their families, that they wanted to have a better future for themselves. And then as the longer we began to talk, I also began to realize that they weren't anywhere nearly as naive as I thought them initially to be. They were all incredibly pessimistic about their own futures. I mean, these were boys who were 15, and by the end of the second night, they were saying, well, they know that they have no future already. They would say that if they could get out of here, they'd be able to make their way to the States and have an education, that if there was any one thing that they could do in the world, it would be to go to school. But they recognized by this point that would probably never happen for them, and so they had already decided that they were trying to fight for the next generation, when in fact they were barely, they were still children themselves.
Oh.
We are just running out of time for this part of the program, but if anybody has any questions for Dinaw or for Lucas, we definitely pass around a microphone.
Not for me, for Dinaw, please.
More for Dinaw. Anybody? One thing I'm a little bit curious about, I know you went through an MFA program earlier on, and there's always the debate of innate talent versus what you can pick up from a program like that. Are there any kind of specific things that you feel like the program you went through particularly helped you with or inhibited you with?
And now you teach too.
And now you teach, so.
I do, so I have to say MFA programs are the best things in the world. And
well, we're off the record here. Give us the truth.
I'd say one of the more invaluable things is that they taught me how to be a better reader, and that's a pretty wonderful gift to have. They taught me how to sort of read. You sort of learn how to read as using theory and all sorts of other things when you're in college. But you don't really learn, I think, how to read quietly and patiently. Like I sort of hate that term because it's a little bit overused, but to read like a writer, where you begin to actually read with a real concern for the way sentences are sort of constructed and the way characters kind of are born over the course of a handful of pages in the story. And so you begin to read with this sort of sense of marvel and a sense of like, I want to see how it's possible to do that through language, and that's great. Beyond that, MFAs they're there to also kind of make you quite skeptical of yourself, and that's a pretty good thing as well. So you go through this process of being constantly criticized and rejected, and that's a way of arming you for what's going to happen as soon as you actually leave an MFA program and step off into the real world, and you have plenty of people doing that for you.
Yeah. Interesting. Are you working on another novel yet?
Yes, it's
awesome.
Yeah, it's still in the very early stages, but yeah, there's always something that's slowly trying to work its way out.
Cool. Anybody out there? I'm going to bring you a microphone. Sure.
I would actually like to thank you. We're from the same origins country, and having gone through some of the experiences that you actually noted in your book myself, and having come here and having deal with the different nuances of both having to deal with a different culture, learning to adapt in that culture, and having to actually come out and sort of transform myself. I think when I heard you on the NPR show today, I said, I'm not going to miss this talk. And that's why I showed up today. You were with Leonard Lopez, I think, today, this morning. And I was driving with my son, who's about 20 years old. And we were both fascinated. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. But I told him, I said, I'm going to make it. I'm going to give you a second-hand report. So I'd like to thank you and say that this is certainly makes me proud.
Well, thank you.
And makes me be hopeful that in spite of all the dangers that we all face, I think as human beings, forgetting color, race, identity, gender. I think it is a testament to the human spirit, and I think I'd like to just make a statement, say thank you for that.
Well, thank you. That is, I think, the sort of wonderful encapsulation of what sort of a novelist's sort of greatest intent is. You know, I always think that there's the sort of like leap of faith that has to happen when a writer begins to try to write a story, and that also happens with the reader, where you begin to see that, you know, I can sort of share stories of myself, of my family, and I can transfer those onto the page, and readers who share the same background and readers who don't, who come from entirely different places, will still find a way of finding themselves attached to these characters, will find a way of seeing themselves reflected in these characters, and that is the sort of lovely feat that the imagination is capable of, and that I think sort of affirms exactly what you were saying, that, you know, we are more than the sort of sum total of our shallow lives, and we can sort of move beyond the surface of our skin to somebody else's lives quite easily if we give ourselves the chance. So
cool. Is anybody else out there? Questions, comments, stories?
I was just really struck by the absence of women, you know, African women revolutionaries, or anything, you know, whatever you want to call them, students even on the campus. And I just wanted to know if that was really like a deliberate thing on your part, because historically also that kind of is the case, and women haven't had the chance to go abroad to study like the men did, you know. So I just wanted to know what your thinking was behind that.
You're definitely right. There is a definite absence. There are small women characters who make a role in the college campus, but they are not that present in the story at all. And I would say it wasn't by no means, of course, any attempt to try to echo what was sort of probably fairly accurate at the time, but really because the story for me is about the sort of friendship of these two men, more so than it is about the sort of revolutionary politics of the time. What compelled me more was how these two young men come together on this college campus. They're both drawn to it because of the ideas represented by the politics, but really it's about their friendship and how the two of them are going to try to possibly make a better life for themselves, and how the love that sort of builds between them, you know, serves as some minor form of grace for them over the course of the novel. But you're right. I mean, there is this sort of hole, definitely, and you know, I can't excuse it. I don't want to pretend like it's like, you know, there's a justification for it that's valid. It's just, it is one of the absences of the novel, which is also why then you say, well, that's why we have wonderful women who will come and tell those stories.
Any other questions or comments tonight? All right, well, on behalf of the Strand, you have one. Good.
Sorry, 5 minutes. Yeah, I just want to go back to your comment previously about what you said about the immigrant narrative as being a construct. I mean, it struck me that your all three novels, actually, of course you could say that, you know, on the one hand, they are all variations of the immigrant narrative or reinscriptions of the immigrant narrative. But I was also wondering, for example, in your very first novel, the protagonist comes from Ethiopia and basically lives in Washington, D.C., and it's a D.C. that's been very much gentrified. And so that seems to me a very kind of sensitive depiction of this class politics that's going on as well. So I was wondering to what extent you would actually say that your narratives are not only you know, kind of reinscriptions of the immigrant narrative, but also to what extent do you very consciously want to comment on, you know, class issues as well? So not only race and not only gender or the lack of it in certain episodes in history and in post-colonial era, but also you know, how issues of class are very much at the forefront.
You know, definitely in that first novel, they were very important in my mind, and the idea of the immigrant narrative as being a construct is very much reflected in the way that gentrification actually creates another form of displacement. So that's why, to me, the idea of the immigrant novel is quite limited in its meaning, because it seems to only apply to people who have left their homes, and really what we're talking about is displacement. We're talking about sort of loss, and loss on a sort of different, on various grand scales, and so people losing their homes and losing their communities because they can no longer afford to live there and are sort of cast out. That's a rather traumatic event for them as well, and that does, you know, to me, qualify as the same form of displacement that migrants will feel when they leave their homes, and we oftentimes don't think of them on the same terms. And the sort of economic and class divides that mix and are inevitably intertwined with race were very important to that novel, and carry some of the same echoes definitely into this novel. So, you know, I don't I always believe that it's important to not hide from your sort of politics, but you don't write out of your politics, but you know that you have these sort of political ideas and they shape and define the way you see the world, and you can't help but hope those ideas will express themselves through your characters in ways that avoid the sort of didacticism of easy politics, or sort of that becomes propaganda, but you want to show how lives are impacted by politics and political decisions that people make.
Frustrated sometimes when when writers, migrant writers, get clumped together. So it's another Jhumpa Lahiri, it's another Monica Ali, and it seemed to me that your first novel was doing something very different. So some of the reviews that I read, I just felt very angry when I read them.
Because it's such a silly idea. Like somebody comes from, there's a great British writer who said the great thing about being from Western Europe is that we're never immigrants, we're always expats. So it's true. Like somebody from London comes and writes about New York, no one's going to say that's the great immigrant novel, and be like, there's an expat. I lived in France for years. No one ever called me an immigrant. Not once, because I was an American first, and that American gave me a different identity. So the idea of the immigrant is itself is sort of is very much a construct based on political, socioeconomic lines.
Sorry.
No.
All right, well, thank you, Dinaw, and thank you so much, Lucas, for joining us tonight. Thank you guys all for coming, too. If you haven't already checked out a copy of all our names, please do so on your way out. Take care.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.